August 31st, 1944, 50 miles east of Paris. Private James Rucard stood beside his GMC truck at a fuel depot and watched the impossible happen. The most aggressive, fastest-moving army in American history had just stopped dead. Not because the Germans had stopped them. Not because they'd run into fortifications or encountered heavy resistance. They stopped because every tank, every truck, every vehicle in General George Patton's Third Army had run completely dry, 400 miles in 30 days. They'd liberated Paris. They'd chased a broken German army across France. They were 30 miles from the German border, one good push from driving straight into the heart of the Reich. The German forces were shattered, retreating, desperate. One more thrust and the war might end by Christmas. But Patton's tanks sat silent in French fields. His trucks were useless metal. His entire army, 250,000 men spread across northeastern France, had consumed every drop of fuel in the supply system. Third Army had requested 400,000 gallons of gasoline that day. They received 31,000. Without fuel, the most powerful mechanized force ever assembled was just expensive sculpture sitting motionless, while the Germans, who should have been finished, got time to breathe, time to regroup, time to build new defenses, time to turn a rout into a fight. Rucard was 19 years old. He'd been in France 8 weeks. He was a truck driver with the 514th Quartermaster Regiment, and he didn't know it yet. But he and thousands of men like him were about to attempt something the Army said was impossible. They were going to move 20,000 tons of supplies per day across 200 miles of French countryside. They were going to drive around the clock without sleep. They were going to keep 2 entire armies advancing when conventional military wisdom said those armies had to stop. They were going to do it with trucks the Army didn't think were important and drivers the Army didn't think were capable. And they were going to prove that sometimes wars aren't won by the men who fire the guns. They're won by the men who bring the bullets. The real problem was that nobody had planned for this. American strategy called for methodical advance across France, build supply depots, repair railroads, secure ports, move forward in stages. Patton had ignored all of that. He broke out of Normandy on August 1st and just kept going. 80 miles a day, 100 miles. The Germans couldn't stop him, so he didn't stop himself. By late August, Third Army was 350 miles from the nearest functioning port. Logistics officers were screaming that the advance had to halt. Patton told them to find a way. What nobody seemed to understand was that the United States had created a military that ran entirely on oil. Everything moved by truck, tank, or plane. An armored division needed 73.7 gallons of fuel to move 100 miles. Patton had multiple armored divisions, multiple infantry divisions, all burning through fuel at rates that made logistics officers physically ill. First and Third Armies together consumed approximately 800,000 gallons per day, every single day. The fuel existed. It sat on Normandy beaches in 55-gallon drums and 5-gallon jerry cans, thousands of tons of it. But it was 200 miles away, and the only vehicles available to move it were the same trucks supposed to be hauling ammunition, food, medical supplies, and everything else an army needed. The front kept moving farther away. Meanwhile, in eastern France, the German First Army was doing something the Americans couldn't quite believe. They were moving supplies with horses. Not a few horses for ceremonial purposes, hundreds of thousands of horses. Every German infantry division in 1943 employed 2,752 horses pulling wagons, hauling artillery, carrying supplies. Earlier in the war, divisions had required between 4,000 and 6,000 horses each. The entire German logistics system from railhead to front line ran on animals that had to be fed, watered, rested, and replaced when they died. The German army had entered the war with 514,000 horses, 75 million. Over 1 million were in service at any given time. More horses than Napoleon had used in 1812. More horses than any army in history. This wasn't a choice the Germans made because horses were better. It was a choice forced on them by reality. Germany didn't have enough oil, they didn't have enough trucks, they didn't have enough industrial capacity to build trucks fast enough. So they used horses, and it was killing them. A horse could pull a wagon about 25 miles a day before needing rest. A truck could drive 300 miles if you had fuel and a driver willing to stay awake. A horse ate 12 pounds of grain every day whether it was working or not. A truck only burned fuel when it moved. A 1943 German infantry division needed 53 tons of horse fodder every single day. That fodder had to be transported from railhead to front, which meant more horses pulling more wagons full of food for the horses pulling the wagons. The logistics were insane. German planners calculated that horse-drawn divisions couldn't operate more than 25 miles from a railhead before the horses spent more capacity hauling their own food than hauling military supplies. Beyond that distance, the whole system collapsed into an absurd spiral where horses hauled food for horses hauling food for horses. The Americans didn't have that problem. American trucks didn't eat when they weren't moving. They didn't get sick. They didn't need veterinarians. They didn't panic under artillery fire. They just needed fuel and a driver. And on August 31st, 1944, the American Army had plenty of both. They just couldn't get them to the same place at the same time. That morning, Ricard had driven his empty truck from a forward depot back to the beaches at Normandy. The round trip was over 400 miles. It took 54 hours if you didn't stop except for fuel, if nothing broke down, if you didn't fall asleep at the wheel and drive into a ditch. Ricard had been making that run every 3 days for 2 weeks. He was exhausted. Every driver was exhausted. They were averaging 4 hours of sleep per night, sometimes less. The trucks were breaking down faster than mechanics could fix them. Transmissions burning out, tires shredding, engines overheating. French roads weren't built for the kind of traffic the Americans were running. Convoys of hundreds of trucks running 24 hours a day, grinding pavement into dust and potholes. But the trucks kept moving because if they stopped, the army stopped. The breaking point had been approaching for weeks. In early August, the logistics situation had been manageable. Supply depots were relatively close to the front. Trucks could make quick runs, but as Patton pushed farther east, distances grew. A truck that could make 3 round trips per day in early August could barely make 1 by late August. Same truck, same driver, but 3 times less capacity simply because of distance. Supply officers watched maps with growing alarm, red pins showing supply dumps, blue pins showing frontline positions, the gap between them growing wider every day. They ran calculations, projected tonnages, estimated breaking points. Their math said the advance would have to stop by September. The only question was whether it would be a controlled halt or complete collapse. On the evening of August 21, 1944, Colonel Loren Ayres had been given an impossible mission. They called him Little Patton because of his intensity and his refusal to accept the word impossible. Ayres was a logistics officer with communications zone. His job was to keep supply lines functioning. On August 21st, the supply lines were not functioning. Third Army was advancing so fast, supply trucks couldn't keep up. First Army to the north had the same problem. Entire divisions were running out of ammunition, fuel, food, everything. Supreme Headquarters was in a panic. If the advance stalled, the Germans would dig in. If the Germans dug in, the war would drag on for months, maybe years. Thousands more Americans would die fighting for ground that could have been taken in weeks if logistics held. General Eisenhower's staff gave Ayres and Major Gordon Gravel 36 hours to come up with a solution. They worked through the night of August 21st. They worked through August 22nd. They drank coffee, studied maps, calculated tonnages, argued about routes, and tried to figure out how to move 20,000 tons of supplies per day across 200 miles of French countryside with a truck fleet already operating at maximum capacity. The solution they came up with was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Create dedicated truck routes, ban all other traffic, run trucks in a continuous loop, loaded going east, empty coming back, commandeer every available truck in the European theater, pull drivers from units not in direct combat, form provisional truck companies, work the drivers around the clock in shifts, maximize every hour, every mile, every gallon of fuel. They called it the Red Ball Express, named after an old railroad term for priority freight trains that had right-of-way over everything else. Red Ball meant, move fast, move now. That statement became the mission. That statement became the standard every driver would be measured against. The organizational challenge was immense. Ayres and his staff had to coordinate with dozens of different commands. They needed to identify which units could spare drivers. They needed to requisition trucks from formations across the theater. They needed to establish refueling points, maintenance depots, traffic control posts. They needed to create an entirely new supply network from scratch in less than 4 days. The plan involved repurposing 132 existing military trucking operations into a unified system. Trucks would be pulled from across the European theater. Some came from anti-aircraft units that weren't seeing much action. Some came from engineering battalions. Some came from chemical smoke companies. 10 trucking companies with 340 vehicles came from anti-aircraft units alone. Military police would control traffic. The 793rd Military Police Battalion, activated in December 1942, was assigned to secure routes and keep traffic moving. Engineers would maintain roads. Ordnance teams would repair disabled vehicles. Quartermaster units would operate loading and unloading operations. It was logistics on a scale never attempted before. The plan went into effect on August 25, 1944. Ayres needed 23,000 drivers. Most units resisted giving up their men. Ayres didn't care. He went to headquarters after headquarters, requisitioned soldiers whose jobs weren't immediately critical, and told them they were truck drivers now. Most of these men had never driven a truck before. Some had never driven anything before. The Army gave them basic training, handed them keys, and put them on the road. 75% of the Red Ball drivers were black. Not because black soldiers were better drivers, but because the United States Army in 1944 believed that black men weren't capable of combat, so they were assigned to service units, quartermaster companies, transportation battalions, jobs white officers considered safe and non-essential, loading supplies, maintaining equipment, driving trucks. The irony was that these men, dismissed as unfit for combat, were about to prove they were essential to victory. James Rucard was one of them. He was from Cleveland, Ohio. He'd been drafted in March 1943. The Army looked at him, saw a black teenager from an industrial city, and assigned him to Quartermaster Corps. He learned to drive a 2.5-ton truck in a Georgia training camp. He shipped to England in June 1944. He landed in France in July. By August, he was driving the Red Ball Express. The work was terrifying. Routes were marked with signs showing red balls painted on circular backgrounds. All civilian traffic was banned. All military traffic not part of the express was banned. The roads belonged to the trucks, but the roads also belonged to German aircraft, German artillery, German stragglers who hadn't gotten the message that they were supposed to be retreating. Drivers carried rifles they rarely had time to use. They drove with windshields down because a glint of glass could bring down artillery fire. They drove at night with cat-eye blackout lights that let you see maybe 30 feet ahead. They drove through rain, through mud, through darkness so complete you could barely see the truck in front of you. They drove until they couldn't stay awake anymore. Then they drove some more because the front needed fuel and ammunition, and if you stopped moving, men died. Rucard saw trucks get blown up by German bombs. He saw trucks roll over on curves because drivers fell asleep. He saw trucks break down and get pushed off the road because there was no time to stop and fix them. The convoy just kept moving. If your truck died, you hitched a ride back and got a new truck. He watched German prisoners of war sabotage vehicles by putting water in gas cans. He watched French civilians try to steal supplies. He watched American soldiers do the same thing. Gasoline on the black market could fetch $100 per jerry can. Cigarettes and food were worth their weight in gold. Some drivers got rich. Most just kept driving. The dangers were constant and varied. German aircraft, though increasingly rare by late summer 1944, still posed threats. Luftwaffe pilots hunted for supply convoys, knowing that destroying American logistics was as valuable as destroying American combat units. Drivers learned to watch the skies, to recognize the sound of approaching engines, to know the difference between friendly and enemy aircraft. German stragglers presented another threat. Isolated German units cut off from their own forces sometimes ambushed supply convoys to steal food and fuel. Some drivers found themselves in firefights defending their trucks with rifles against German soldiers, just as desperate as they were. The roads themselves were dangerous. French highways built for civilian traffic weren't designed for the punishment the Red Ball inflicted. Pavement cracked and crumbled under constant heavy loads, shoulders eroded, bridges weakened. Drivers learned which routes were safe and which weren't, which bridges could handle a loaded truck and which would collapse. Weather added another layer of difficulty. Rain turned unpaved sections into mud, fog reduced visibility to nearly zero, wind buffeted high-sided cargo trucks, making them difficult to control at speed. Drivers learned to handle every condition because stopping wasn't an option. Accidents were inevitable. Trucks collided in darkness. Vehicles ran off roads. Drivers misjudged curves and rolled their trucks. Some accidents resulted from mechanical failure, others from driver exhaustion, many from simple bad luck. Every accident cost time, cost supplies, sometimes cost lives. But convoys kept moving because for every truck that broke down, there were 5 more behind it, carrying the fuel and ammunition the front needed. The statistics were staggering. At peak operation, nearly 6,000 trucks were on the road simultaneously. 900 trucks were moving at any given moment. Convoys stretched from Normandy to points near the German border. The primary route ran from Normandy beaches through Chartres, past Paris, through Soissons, and on toward the front. Secondary routes branched off to supply different army sectors. The total network covered over 350 miles one way, 700 miles round trip for some drivers. Highway markers bearing the red ball symbol appeared every few miles. Military police checkpoints controlled access. Only red ball trucks were permitted on designated routes. Everything else, civilian vehicles, regular military traffic, even supply convoys not part of the express, had to use other roads. The routes themselves became almost sacred. Engineers worked constantly to maintain pavement. Potholes were filled within hours. Damaged bridges received priority repairs. Any obstacle that might slow convoys was removed immediately. The roads had to stay open because if they closed, the advance stopped. Loading operations at Normandy beaches ran 24 hours per day. Trucks arrived empty, were directed to specific loading zones based on what supplies were needed at the front. Quartermasters had manifests showing what each truck should carry. Fuel trucks got priority routing. Ammunition came next, then food, medical supplies, spare parts. The loading process was supposed to be organized and efficient. In reality, it was controlled chaos. Hundreds of trucks arriving and departing every hour, supplies stacked everywhere, men shouting orders, trying to coordinate movements, attempting to match trucks with loads with destinations. Some drivers waited hours for their turn to load. Others got lucky and loaded immediately. Either way, once loaded, they were expected to drive immediately. No delays, no waiting for convoys to form, just drive. Trucks were supposed to maintain 60-yard intervals and drive at 25 miles per hour. In reality, drivers removed governors from engines and drove at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. They drove alone instead of in convoys because waiting for other trucks wasted time. They violated every rule in the manual because the rules were written for peacetime, and this was war. The French countryside became a blur of motion, truck after truck, hour after hour, day after day. Drivers developed a rhythm: load at the beach, drive east, unload at the depot, drive west, repeat. Some drivers made the run so many times they could navigate the route in complete darkness by memory, knowing every curve, every hill, every dangerous intersection. Sleep became a luxury. Drivers learned to sleep while their partner drove, curled up in the cab or sprawled across ammunition crates in the back. Some learned to sleep for 10-minute intervals at rest stops, then wake up and drive another 6 hours. Coffee helped when they could get it. Benzodrine tablets helped when coffee wasn't enough. Sheer determination helped when nothing else worked. The trucks themselves began to suffer. GMC 2.5-ton trucks were tough, but they weren't designed for this kind of punishment. Engines that should have lasted years were burning out in months. Transmissions designed for normal military use were failing under constant operation. Tires already in short supply were being destroyed by rough roads and excessive speeds. Mechanics worked around the clock trying to keep the fleet running. They cannibalized broken trucks for parts. They improvised repairs that would have made factory engineers cringe but kept vehicles moving. They learned to fix transmissions in the dark, replace engines by flashlight, patch tires with whatever materials were available. Between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything. 12,342 tons per day at peak capacity. The trucks covered over 48 million miles. They wore out more than 40,000 tires in the first month alone. They burned hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel just to deliver fuel. But they kept Patton's Third Army moving. They kept First Army supplied. They kept the advance going when it should have stopped. On September 2, 1944, Patton's tanks started moving again. The fuel had arrived. Not all of it, never enough, but enough to keep rolling. Ruckert had been part of the convoy that delivered it. He'd driven through the night, delivered his load to a forward depot, turned around, and driven back to get more. He didn't see the tanks moving out. He was already back on the road, heading west to pick up another load. He didn't know that his work, the work of thousands of drivers like him, had just saved Patton's advance. The men loading his truck didn't tell him. The officers at the depot didn't thank him. He was just a truck driver. That's what the Army thought. That's what a lot of people thought. But the men at the front knew better. In early September 1944, a tank driver from the 5th Armored Division was interviewed by an Army reporter. The reporter asked what made the difference in the advance across France. The driver said, "If it wasn't for the red ball, we couldn't have moved. They were all black drivers, and they delivered in the heat of combat." Another officer from an armored division said the black drivers delivered gas under constant fire. He said, "Damned if I'd want their job." D. Eisenhower, son of the Supreme Commander, said after the war that without the red ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. These weren't empty compliments. They reflected a fundamental truth that was changing military thinking in real time. Logistics had always mattered in warfare, but never before had logistics been this fast, this flexible, this decisive. Traditional military doctrine held that armies advanced until their supply lines stretched too thin, then paused to consolidate before pushing forward again. The Red Ball Express proved that doctrine could be broken with enough trucks and enough determination. Armies could advance continuously, could maintain offensive momentum, could keep enemies off balance indefinitely. This realization changed how American commanders planned operations. Before the Red Ball, an advance of 400 miles in 30 days would have been considered impossible from a logistics standpoint. After the Red Ball, it became the baseline expectation. Commanders knew that if they could win battles, logistics could support their advance. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. German intelligence officers tried to understand how American armies could move so far, so fast. They analyzed American tactics, American equipment, American doctrine. What they found was that the decisive advantage wasn't in tactics or equipment, it was in logistics. The Americans could sustain operations that German logistics simply couldn't match. German commanders adjusted their strategies accordingly. They stopped planning counteroffensives based on the assumption that American supply lines would overextend. They stopped expecting American advances to pause for logistical consolidation. They learned that American armies would keep coming, supplied by an endless stream of trucks that never stopped moving. Meanwhile, the German army was dying from the feet up. Not from bullets, from logistics. Every infantry division needed horses. Those horses needed food. That food had to come from somewhere. And in 1944, somewhere meant German-occupied territory that was shrinking by the day. By September, German divisions were operating 90 miles from the nearest railhead. The plan said they shouldn't operate more than 25 miles out. The plan said the logistics would collapse. The plan was right. German supply columns were horse-drawn wagons moving at walking speed. It took days to move supplies that American trucks moved in hours. When German units retreated, they often had to abandon heavy equipment because horses couldn't pull it fast enough. When German units advanced, they often outran their supply wagons and had to stop and wait for food and ammunition to catch up. The American Army never had that problem. When American units advanced, the trucks followed, fast. The contrast between American and German logistics was stark. An American armored division could move 100 miles, fight a battle, and be resupplied by nightfall. A German infantry division attempting the same movement would outrun its supply wagons and be without ammunition or food within 24 hours. American commanders planned operations knowing their logistics could support rapid advances. German commanders planned operations knowing their logistics couldn't. This fundamental difference shaped every battle, every campaign, every strategic decision. Stories circulated among American troops about German reactions to American logistics. Some accounts, never fully verified but widely told, described captured German soldiers watching American landing craft unload endless streams of trucks and asking their guards where the horses were. Whether these specific incidents occurred or became part of soldier folklore, they reflected a real gap in understanding. The Germans had built an army around animal transport. The Americans had built an army around mechanical transport. One system belonged to the past, the other belonged to the future. By October 1944, German intelligence officers were writing reports about American logistics capabilities. They noted that American supply columns could move at speeds that made German horse-drawn transport obsolete. They noted that American trucks could operate in weather conditions that immobilized horses. They noted that American vehicles didn't require the massive amounts of fodder that German animals consumed. They noted that the American logistical advantage was insurmountable. One intelligence assessment from 1st Army headquarters concluded that the Americans had solved the problem of mobile warfare in a way the Germans could not replicate. The report noted that American motorized logistics allowed sustained advances over distances that would have been impossible with animal transport. The report concluded that unless Germany found a way to match American mobility, the war was lost. The report was correct. In Russia during winter 1941, the German army had learned what happened when horse-drawn logistics failed. The advance on Moscow stalled in December, not because German soldiers weren't willing to fight, but because the horses couldn't move in the cold. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Horses froze to death by the thousands. The ones that survived couldn't pull wagons through snow and ice. In December 1941 and January 1942 alone, 179,000 German horses died on the Eastern Front. The number doesn't include horses that died of disease, exhaustion, or starvation, just the ones that froze. German divisions that had started Operation Barbarossa in June with 6,000 horses were down to a few hundred by winter. Supply wagons sat immobilized, artillery couldn't move, ammunition didn't reach the front. Soldiers went hungry. The entire offensive ground to a halt because the logistics system was built on animals that couldn't survive the Russian winter. American trucks didn't have that problem. They ran in heat, in cold, in rain, in snow. If the engine started, the truck moved. If the truck broke down, you got another truck. You didn't have to wait 3 years for a horse to mature. You didn't have to train it. You didn't have to find food for it. You just needed fuel and a driver. The difference went beyond simple mechanical reliability. It was a difference in strategic vision. The United States understood that modern industrial warfare required industrial logistics. You couldn't fight with factories and still supply with farms. You couldn't build tanks in Detroit and supply them with wagons pulled by horses. Germany had tried to split the difference. They built tanks and planes with the most advanced technology of the era, then supplied them with methods Napoleon would have recognized. That contradiction doomed them. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had accomplished its mission. The port of Antwerp in Belgium had been captured and opened. French railroads had been partially repaired. Portable fuel pipelines had been laid from the coast to forward areas. The desperate emergency that had created the Red Ball was over. On November 16th, the operation officially ended. The trucks returned to their original units. The drivers went back to their regular assignments. The signs with the red balls came down. But what the Red Ball Express had done changed how the American Army understood logistics. Before the Red Ball, logistics was something you planned carefully. You built depots, you established supply lines, you moved forward in stages. The Red Ball proved that if you had enough trucks and enough drivers willing to work themselves to exhaustion, you could sustain an advance over distances nobody thought possible. You could outrun your supply lines and then build new ones on the fly. You could keep moving when conventional wisdom said you had to stop. The lessons learned from the Red Ball Express influenced military logistics for decades. The principles established in those 83 days, priority routes, centralized control, continuous movement, became standard doctrine. Future operations in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond would apply Red Ball principles on even larger scales. The Red Ball also influenced civilian logistics. After the war, General Eisenhower championed the interstate highway system, partly based on what he'd learned about the importance of good roads from the Red Ball experience. The modern logistics industry, with its emphasis on continuous movement and just-in-time delivery, owes something to those drivers racing across France in 1944. But perhaps most importantly, the Red Ball Express demonstrated that logistics isn't just a support function. Logistics is combat. The men driving those trucks were fighting just as surely as the men firing rifles at the front. They were fighting against distance, against time, against exhaustion. They were fighting to keep armies moving, to keep pressure on the enemy, to end the war as quickly as possible. Every gallon of fuel delivered meant tanks could advance. Every crate of ammunition meant artillery could fire. Every box of rations meant soldiers could fight. The Red Ball drivers never fired a shot in anger, but they enabled millions of shots to be fired by the men at the front. The Germans never learned that lesson. They entered the war with an army that moved on horses, and they ended the war the same way. In 1943, of 322 German divisions, only 52 were motorized. By 1944, only 42 of 264 combat divisions were motorized. The rest relied on horses. At war's end in 1945, Germany still had over 1 million horses in military service. The United States entered the war in 1941 with a plan to motorize everything. By 1944, every American division had hundreds of trucks. The entire logistics system, from factories in Detroit to front lines in France, ran on wheels and engines. American industry produced over 2 million trucks during the war. Germany produced far fewer. The difference wasn't just industrial capacity, it was strategic vision. The United States understood that modern warfare required modern logistics. You couldn't fight a mechanized war with animals. You couldn't sustain rapid advances with supply wagons moving at walking speed. You needed trucks. The men who proved that weren't generals or engineers. They were 19-year-old kids from Cleveland and Arkansas and Georgia. Most of them black, most of them assigned to jobs the Army considered unimportant. They drove trucks for 83 days and changed the war. James Rucard survived the war. He continued driving trucks through France, Belgium, and into Germany. He watched the war end in May 1945. He returned to the United States in December 1946. He went back to Cleveland. He rarely talked about the Red Ball Express. When people asked what he did in the war, he said he drove a truck. He didn't mention the 54-hour round trips. He didn't mention driving at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour on blacked-out roads while German artillery fired in the distance. He didn't mention watching trucks explode. He didn't mention the exhaustion, the fear, the absolute certainty that if you stopped moving, men at the front would die. He just said he drove a truck. Rucard returned to a Cleveland that hadn't changed much despite the war. Jobs were still segregated. Neighborhoods were still divided. The GI Bill promised education and home loans, but banks often refused to lend to black veterans. Employers who needed workers during the war went back to preferring white applicants. Rucard found work where he could. He drove trucks in civilian life. The same skill he'd learned in the Army now applied to peacetime commerce. He married, raised a family, lived a quiet life. The medals he'd earned, 5 Bronze Stars for his service, sat in a drawer. The Pentagon had sent him official recognition, but that meant little when trying to get a mortgage or find steady employment. Many Red Ball drivers had similar experiences. They'd proven their worth in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. They demonstrated courage, skill, and determination. They'd been essential to Allied victory. Then they came home to an America that still didn't consider them equal citizens. Some found success despite the obstacles. They used the GI Bill to get educations, started businesses, built careers. Others struggled, caught between the pride of what they'd accomplished and the frustration of a society that didn't value their contributions. In 1999, a reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer found Rucard and interviewed him about the Red Ball Express. Rucard was 74 years old. He remembered everything. He remembered the cat-eye lights that barely let you see the road. He remembered being afraid he would get killed. He remembered General Patton saying, "You had to be there. You drove all day and night if that's what it took." He remembered the trucks breaking down and getting fixed and running again. He said, "We hauled anything General Patton needed. We took supplies all the way to the front line." The interview was one of the first times Rucard had spoken publicly about his service. By 1999, enough time had passed that people were finally interested in hearing the stories. Historians were beginning to recognize that the Red Ball Express had been more than just a logistics operation. It had been a demonstration of what Black Americans could accomplish when given the opportunity. Rucard died a few years later, having finally received some recognition for what he and his fellow drivers had achieved. But for most of his life, his contribution to winning the war had gone largely unacknowledged. Washington Rector, another Red Ball driver from the 39th 16th Quartermaster Truck Company, remembered the discrimination. He said, "You accepted discrimination." The races were kept so separate that decades later, some white veterans didn't know that most Red Ball drivers were black. One white veteran told a historian he'd driven for the Red Ball. The historian asked why he wasn't black. The veteran didn't understand the question. He genuinely didn't know that 3/4 of the drivers had been African American. That separation, that invisibility, meant the Red Ball Express didn't become famous the way combat units became famous. There was no movie about it until 1952, and even that film was largely fictional. The men who drove the trucks weren't celebrated. They weren't given parades. Most of them went home, went back to their lives, and nobody thanked them. But the Army knew. The logistics officers knew. The generals knew. Without the Red Ball Express, Patton's Third Army would have stopped in September 1944 and stayed stopped until supply lines caught up. That would have given Germany months to rebuild defenses, months to fortify the West Wall, months to move divisions from other fronts. The war would have lasted longer. More Americans would have died. More Europeans would have suffered under occupation. The Red Ball Express shortened the war, not by winning battles, but by making battles possible, by keeping armies moving when they should have stopped, by proving that logistics, boring, unglamorous logistics, could be as decisive as any tank or aircraft. The German army never understood this. They saw logistics as a support function, something that followed the combat troops. The Americans understood that logistics was combat. If your supplies move faster than the enemy's, you win. If your trucks can go anywhere in any weather, you win. If your drivers are willing to work until they collapse, you win. The Red Ball Express wasn't about trucks. It was about the men who drove them. Men who were told they weren't good enough for combat. Men who proved they were essential to victory. Men who drove through exhaustion and fear and discrimination because the job had to be done and they were the ones doing it. In the final analysis, Germany lost the war for many reasons, but one of those reasons was horses. 75 million horses that ate food, required care, moved slowly, and died in the cold. Animals that represented a logistics system designed for the 19th century trying to fight a 20th century war. The United States won for many reasons, but one of those reasons was trucks. Millions of trucks driven by men the Army underestimated, moving supplies at speeds the Germans couldn't match. That's how logistics wins wars. Not with grand strategy or brilliant tactics, but with 19-year-old drivers who keep moving when everything in their body says, stop. With mechanics who fix broken transmissions in the middle of the night. With officers who refuse to accept that something is impossible and find a way to make it work anyway. The Red Ball Express ran for 83 days. In that time, it moved 412,193 tons of supplies. It kept two armies advancing when they should have stopped. It helped end the war months earlier than it would have ended otherwise, and it did all of that with trucks instead of horses. Therein lies the difference between victory and defeat. Sometimes it's not about who has the better tanks or the better generals. Sometimes it's about who has the better trucks and the men willing to drive them. The road stretches out ahead, marked with red balls that nobody sees anymore. But somewhere in France, if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might still hear the sound of engines, GMC trucks running flat out with their governors removed, carrying fuel to armies that refused to stop, driven by men who were told they didn't matter but proved they were the difference between victory and defeat. They were just truck drivers. They just changed the world. If you found this story compelling, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to understand what previous generations sacrificed, subscribe to keep these forgotten histories alive. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas or Tennessee, Ohio or Oregon, you're part of a community that believes these stories matter. These men mattered. These sacrifices mattered. And as long as we remember, their contribution never truly dies. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the most important warriors are the ones nobody remembers to thank.